Welcome to Uncle Das Financial Diary, a show hoping everyone can get rich. This is the Finance Growth Channel. Today we're diving into a heavyweight book on economics. It's Paul Samuelson's Economics. The title alone should give you a hint. This book is a benchmark classic for introductory economics. It was the first to integrate micro and macroeconomics into a unified framework, a logic that has since been adopted by almost all introductory textbooks. It's a core text for economic enlightenment in universities worldwide. Alright, enough talk. Buckle up, we're taking off. When people mention economics, many think of complex formulas and obscure terminology. But Samuelson's Economics is entirely different. It's a mental map that allows ordinary people to see through the logic of how the world works. It's also a monumental work of economics, having undergone 19 revisions over 60 years. From the price fluctuations of your daily groceries to wage changes, housing trends, to national tax policies and global trade friction, this book holds the underlying answers to all these questions. Its core value lies in transforming rigorous academic theory into life logic that everyone can understand. Samuelson, the first American Nobel laureate in economics, built this framework with his lifelong wisdom, and Nordhaus continued to update it. It preserves the core truths of economics while remaining relevant to reality. From the causes of the 2008 financial crisis to the marginal utility of why bubble tea becomes less satisfying the more you drink, all can find accessible explanations in the book. Reading it closely isn't about becoming an economist, but about learning to dissect phenomena with economic thinking. When you see prices rise, you'll no longer just blame greedy merchants, but be able to analyze the multiple impacts of supply, demand, costs, and policies. When making decisions, you'll no longer rely on intuition, but be able to weigh costs and benefits. What's even more remarkable is its clear writing logic, as if tailor-made for us to study closely, starting with basic concepts, then extending to micro markets and macro control, and finally grounding in global economics and real-world policies. This structure, from the ground up to application from individual to whole, perfectly helps us build a complete knowledge system. And our first step in studying it closely is to first grasp its underlying logic. Understanding the most core principles of economics, scarcity, efficiency, and supply and demand. Only then can we follow the author's train of thought to gradually unlock subsequent market operations, policy analysis, and other content. Therefore, the charm of this monumental work is never its authoritative aura, but its ability to let us view the world with a rational eye, both answering present confusions and providing support for future choices. Next, we will follow the author's logic and start with the fundamental logic of economics, gradually understanding this classic. Building on the core value mentioned earlier, we must first thoroughly understand the foundation of economics, the underlying thinking that runs through the entire book and explains all economic phenomena. Samuelson points out in the opening that the essence of economics is the science of choice in a world of scarcity. This core idea is precisely our key to understanding subsequent micro-market operations and macro policy control. Only by mastering this set of underlying logic first can we follow the author's C. to unlock more complex economic laws. Two core propositions: scarcity and efficiency. All discussions in economics begin with an unavoidable reality. Scarcity is ubiquitous, and efficiency is the core solution to scarcity. First, it's important to clarify that scarcity is not absolute shortage, but rather that resources are always limited relative to humanity's infinite desires. We face scarcity every day. For office workers, time is scarce, requiring allocation between work, study, and leisure. Ordinary people's income is scarce, requiring trade-offs between mortgage payments, childcare, and savings. A nation's fiscal funds are scarce, requiring choices between infrastructure, public welfare, and national defense. Even seemingly inexhaustible resources, like clean air and public green spaces, can become scarce once they exceed environmental carrying capacity or usage limits. Will also become scarce. This scarcity is not an exception of a certain era or country, but an eternal state of human society. This is also the fundamental reason why economics has become an independent discipline. And efficiency is essentially how to use limited resources to satisfy the most and the most urgent needs. It's not the more the better, but just right. For example, companies produce products that meet consumer needs at the lowest cost. Governments leverage limited fiscal funds to achieve the greatest improvement in people's livelihoods. Individuals gain the most growth returns in a day. These are all manifestations of efficiency. Here we need to avoid a common misconception. Scarcity does not equal poverty. Wealthy countries also face scarcity. The US lacks high-tech talent, so it attracts global elites. Japan lacks land, so housing is mostly high-rise small apartments. Scarcity in poor countries is more direct, such as insufficient food and medical resources. But the core contradiction of both is the opposition between limited resources and unlimited demand. And the core mission of economics is to find paths to improve efficiency through division of labor, trade, and technological innovation, to make limited resources play a greater role. 3 basic questions. What to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. The contradiction between scarcity and efficiency ultimately boils down to 3 ultimate questions. These 3 questions must be answered by all economic systems, and different ways of answering them form different economic models. First, what to produce is determined by demand signals. This question is essentially about which products and services society should invest resources in. In a market economy, the answer is given by consumers' money votes and companies' pursuit of profit. Products that consumers are willing to spend money on, companies will find profitable and invest resources to produce. Conversely, products that no one buys will naturally be phased out by companies. For example, the trend of new energy vehicles replacing fuel vehicles in recent years is essentially consumers' demand for environmental protection and low energy consumption willing to pay for electric vehicles, coupled with companies' pursuit of policy dividends and market space, allowing resources to continuously flow into the new energy sector. In a command economy, what to produce is determined by government plans. In reality, a mixed economy is market-led plus government guidance. For example, the government subsidizes grain production to ensure the basic needs of the people, but does not interfere with the taste choices of milk tea shops. This ensures basic needs while maintaining market vitality. Secondly, how to produce is determined by the principle of lowest cost. This question is about what technology and what factor combination to use for production. The goal of a company is profit maximization, so it will choose the production method with the lowest cost. Small restaurants will not use automated equipment because the fixed costs are too high, while chain restaurants will be mechanized on a large scale. Because the larger the scale, the lower the average cost. Developing countries will use labor-intensive technology. Because labor is cheap in developed countries will use capital-intensive technology. Because capital is abundant and labor is expensive. The key here is factor substitution. When the price of a certain factor rises, companies will use cheaper factors to substitute. For example, after oil prices rise, logistics companies will switch to new energy trucks. After workers' wages rise, factories will introduce robots. This substitution behavior is essentially the market guiding resources to more efficient uses, and is also the dynamic answer to how to produce. Then for whom to produce is determined by factor prices. This question is, who is the final destination of products and services? The core is the logic of income distribution. In a market economy, income distribution depends on what factors you own and the scarcity of those factors. Those who own scarce factors such as high-end technology, core connections, and high-quality land can obtain higher returns, manifested as wages, rent, and profits. Those who own ordinary factors such as low-skilled labor receive relatively lower returns. For example, programmers' salaries are higher than cashiers, not because the boss is biased, but because programmers' editing output is higher. An excellent programmer can create millions of output value for the company, while a cashier's output is relatively fixed. This logic seems cold, but it is precisely this distribution method that incentivizes people to learn skills, accumulate capital, and innovate technology, thus promoting the overall efficiency of society. And the government's redistribution policies such as taxes and social security are to compensate for the shortcomings in distribution fairness on the basis of efficiency. The 3 principles of supply and demand, the first law of the economic world. If scarcity and efficiency are the roots of economics, then the principles of supply and demand are its branches. They can help us unlock 80% of everyday economic phenomena, from price fluctuations in the wet market to the volatility of the stock market. Essentially, it's all about changes in the relationship between supply and demand. The essence of the supply and demand principle is simple. The price of a commodity is jointly determined by demand and supply. When demand exceeds supply, meaning more people want to buy than there are sellers, prices will rise. When supply exceeds demand, meaning more sellers than buyers, prices will fall. When supply and demand are equal, prices reach equilibrium and remain temporarily stable. Let's take a most intuitive example. Pork prices always rise before the Spring Festival. This is because Spring Festival is a peak season for demand with households stocking up. The demand curve shifts to the right. Meanwhile, pork supply cannot increase rapidly in the short term, due to the breeding cycle of pigs leading to demand exceeding supply. Prices naturally rise. Conversely, after Spring Festival, demand decreases. This is a direct manifestation of the supply and demand principle. Here's a key point that needs to be well understood. Distinguishing between movement along the curve and shifts of the curve itself. This is crucial for understanding the supply and demand principle, and it's a point many people easily confuse. Movement along the curve refers to changes in quantity supplied or demanded caused solely by price changes. For example, after milk tea prices increase, you buy one less cup. This is a movement up along the demand curve. When milk tea prices drop, the seller produces 100 more cups. This is a movement down along the supply curve. Shifts of the curve itself, on the other hand, refer to changes in quantity supplied or demanded caused by factors other than price. For instance, if your salary increases even if milk tea prices don't drop, you're willing to buy 2 more cups. This is a shift of the demand curve to the right, meaning changes in income lead to increased demand. For example, if a milk tea shop introduces automated equipment, reducing production costs even if prices remain unchanged, the seller is willing to produce more. This is a shift of the supply curve to the right, meaning technological progress leads to increased supply. Understanding this distinction allows us to see through many complex phenomena. For example, the recent decline in housing prices might be due to decreased demand, or increased supply, or a combination of both. Only by distinguishing between a shift of the curve and movement along the curve can we find the essence of the problem. The supply and demand principle is not only applicable to physical goods, but also to services, labor, capital, and other economic resources. For example, labor shortages are essentially insufficient labor supply. For instance, migrant workers returning home, and young people unwilling to engage in manual labor while demand increases, as businesses receive more orders, leading to rising labor prices. For example, after interest rates fall, more people take out loans to buy homes or start businesses. This is a movement along the demand curve for capital. For example, the popularization of online courses is technological progress that shifts the supply curve for educational services to the right, allowing more people access to quality educational resources. By understanding scarcity and efficiency in the 3 fundamental questions, and the underlying logic of supply and demand, we can naturally transition to the core of microeconomics: how the market, through the invisible hand, allocates resources. Because it is scarcity itself that leads to competition. Competition allows the principles of supply and demand to function, and consumers and businesses, guided by supply and demand signals, make decisions about what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. This ultimately forms the laws of market operation. Next, we will follow the author's train of thought to delve into the world of microeconomics, seeing how consumers under budget constraints make their optimal choices. Different market structures such as wet markets, milk tea shops, and public utilities will present what kind of competitive landscape, and all of this is inseparable from the underlying thinking we have just mastered. Building on the underlying logic of the previous module, once we understand core concepts like scarcity and supply and demand, we can delve into the core of microeconomics: how the market's invisible hand guides consumers through price signals. The decisions of an enterprise achieve efficient allocation of resources. Samuelson clearly deconstructs this process in his book, From Individual Consumption and Production Behavior to the Operation of Different Market Structures and the Determination of Factor Prices, ultimately forming a self-regulating resource allocation system. And all of this is based on rational individuals pursuing the maximization of their own interests, unexpectedly achieving the overall efficiency optimization of society. Let's first talk about consumer behavior. Why do you impulsively buy things? Every consumption decision by a consumer is essentially about making the most of a limited budget. Pursuing maximum satisfaction. Economics calls this utility maximization. This seemingly instinctive choice has clear logical rules behind it. The core logic is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Utility is the satisfaction a consumer derives from consumption. Marginal utility refers to the additional satisfaction gained from consuming one more unit of a good. This law states that, as consumption increases, marginal utility gradually decreases. For example, when buying the first cup of milk tea, the sweet aroma and coolness bring great satisfaction. When drinking the second cup, the satisfaction diminishes. The third cup might feel too much. This law directly influences consumption choices. Consumers will prioritize spending their money on goods with the highest marginal utility. For example, with a limited monthly salary, you'll buy necessities first, then consider entertainment and luxury goods until every penny spent on different goods yields equal marginal utility. This is the law of equal marginal utility, and the core of consumer equilibrium. Price changes affect consumption in two ways. One is the substitution effect and the other is the income effect. For example, after pork prices rise, you might buy less pork and more chicken. At the same time, the rise in pork prices reduces your actual purchasing power. Even if you don't switch to chicken, you'll reduce overall meat consumption. These two effects together explain the downward sloping demand curve. When prices rise, the substitution and income effects work together to reduce the quantity demanded. Conversely, they increase it. For example, when mobile phone prices drop, not only are more people willing to upgrade their phones, but some consumers will also give up substitutes like tablets, driving a significant increase in mobile phone sales. Next, let's talk about producer behavior. How do businesses make money and be efficient? The goal of an enterprise is profit maximization, but profit equals total revenue minus total cost. This means that enterprises must make optimal decisions on how much to produce and how to produce. There are two types of costs for an enterprise. Fixed costs are expenses that do not change with output. For example, factory rent and machine depreciation. These must be paid even if nothing is produced. Variable costs are expenses that increase with output. For example, raw materials and labor costs. This distinction determines the production bottom line for an enterprise. In the short run, as long as the product price is higher than the variable cost, the enterprise will continue to produce, at least covering some of the fixed costs. If the price is lower than the variable cost, the enterprise will temporarily halt production. For example, during the pandemic, many small restaurants continued to operate even at a loss, because the price of dishes could cover the variable costs of ingredients and labor. Fixed costs like rent had already been paid. Halting production would result in greater losses. Similar to diminishing marginal utility for consumers, there is a law of diminishing marginal returns in production for enterprises. When other inputs remain constant, continuously increasing one input, such as labor, will initially lead to rapid growth in output. However, beyond a certain limit, the output from additional workers will gradually decrease. For example, the factory becomes crowded, leading to reduced efficiency. Economies of scale are key to reducing costs for enterprises. As production scale expands, average costs gradually decrease. For example, chain restaurants achieve significant cost reductions per dish through bulk purchasing of ingredients and standardized production. Small restaurants, due to their smaller scale, have higher procurement costs, resulting in higher average costs. This also explains why large enterprises emerge in industries. Economies of scale give them a greater competitive advantage. The optimal output for an enterprise is determined by marginal revenue and marginal cost. Marginal revenue is the revenue from selling one additional unit of product. When marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, companies increase profits by producing more. When marginal revenue is less than marginal cost, producing more reduces profits. Only when the two are equal does profit reach its maximum. These principles apply to all businesses, whether it's a small shop or a large factory. For example, a mobile phone manufacturer decides to produce 10 million units annually. This is because they estimate that the marginal revenue of the 10 millionth unit just equals the marginal cost, and producing more would be unprofitable. Furthermore, market structures differ and businesses employ different strategies in different markets. Markets are not monolithic. Varying degrees of competition lead to different market structures, and structure directly impacts resource allocation efficiency. Samuelson categorizes markets into three core forms. First, perfect competition, a free competition where prices follow the market. Characteristics of a perfectly competitive market include numerous sellers and undifferentiated products. Free entry and exit like a farmer's market or a general agricultural product market. In such a market, individual sellers cannot dictate prices. They can only follow the market with prices determined by supply and demand. This type of market has the highest resource allocation efficiency. Businesses must reduce costs and increase efficiency to survive. Consumers can purchase goods at the lowest possible price. For instance, vegetable prices in a farmer's market are transparent and vendors won't arbitrarily raise them, because consumers will switch to other stalls and businesses to be profitable. Will optimize their procurement and sales processes to avoid waste. Second, monopoly, the power to set prices alone. A monopoly market refers to a single enterprise controlling an entire industry. Some public utilities due to the absence of competitors. Monopolistic firms can set high prices, leading to high prices and low output. This reduces consumer welfare and causes resource waste. For example, if a region has only one water supply company, it might raise water prices and reduce investment in water supply facilities. Because even with poor service and high prices, consumers have no alternative choices. This also shows that the invisible hand is not omnipotent. Monopolies lead to market failure. Third, monopolistic competition, differentiated competition. Monopolistic competition is the most common market form, like bubble tea shops and clothing stores. There are many sellers, but their products are differentiated. For example, in taste, style, or brand. Businesses gain some pricing power through differentiation. For instance, a popular bubble tea can be priced 5 yuan higher than a regular one. But it still faces competitive pressure from similar products, requiring continuous innovation, such as introducing new flavors or renovating stores. The core of this market type is differentiated competition. Consumers can choose products that suit their preferences. Businesses continuously optimize services and products through competition. Resources flow to businesses that are more popular with consumers. Factors of production such as labor, land, and capital are also commodities, and their prices, namely wages, rent, and interest, are also determined by supply and demand. This market connects consumers and businesses. Consumers provide labor, land, and other factors, receiving income, while businesses purchase factors for production, forming a complete economic cycle. Let's talk about wages first. Wages are determined by the supply and demand of labor. Scarce factors command higher prices. Excess factors have lower prices. For example, programmers' wages are higher than cashiers. Not because the boss is biased, but because programmers have higher marginal productivity. An excellent programmer can create millions in value for the company, while a cashier's output is relatively fixed. At the same time, wage differences are also influenced by labor quality, work intensity, industry prospects, and other factors. For example, high-risk industries pay higher wages. Highly educated individuals earn more. These are all results of the supply and demand balance in the factor market. Regarding rent and interest, the price of land is rent, determined by its scarcity and use. Land in the city center, due to its prime location, high demand, has much higher rent than suburban land. Fertile land suitable for cultivation also commands higher rent than barren land. The price of capital or interest is the cost of using funds. Interest is a cost when businesses borrow money for investment. Interest is a return when consumers deposit money. Interest rates are determined by the supply and demand of capital. When capital is abundant, interest rates fall. When capital is scarce, interest rates rise. Through consumers, businesses, and market structures, the intricate workings of the market unseen can indeed achieve efficient resource allocation, directing goods to those who need them most, and channeling resources to the most productive enterprises. But Samuelson also emphasized that micro-markets are not perfect. Monopolies lead to high prices and low output. Externalities harm others' interests. Income inequality can trigger social problems. These market failures cannot be resolved by the market alone. They require the intervention of the government, that visible hand, to regulate. And when we shift our perspective from individual markets to the economic operation of the entire nation, considering factors like unemployment, inflation, and economic growth, we enter the realm of macroeconomics. Next, we will follow the author's line of thought to explore how governments use fiscal policy, monetary policy to stabilize the economy, and the core principles of macroeconomic operation. Building upon the micro-market logic of the previous module, Once we understand the workings of individual markets, we need to elevate our view to the economic operation of the entire nation. While the unseen forces of micro-markets can optimize resource allocation, they cannot solve systemic issues like unemployment, inflation, or economic recession. This is the core mission of macroeconomics: to use the government's visible hand to regulate the overall pace of economic activity, achieving goals of stable growth, full employment, and price stability. Samuelson clearly lays out a macroeconomic analytical framework in his book, from measuring core indicators to understanding the nature of economic fluctuations, and then to the application of policy tools, progressively explaining how governments intervene in the economy. Core indicators of macroeconomics. To regulate the economy, one must first understand its health. This requires 3 core indicators as a basis for judgment: GDP, inflation rate, and unemployment rate. These 3 indicators are like a doctor's thermometer and blood pressure monitor, providing a direct reflection of the macroeconomic state. The first indicator, GDP, the yardstick for measuring the total economy. GDP is the most central macroeconomic indicator. It measures the total value of all final goods and services produced by a country in a given period. Many mistakenly believe GDP is the total wealth, but it only counts newly produced items. For example, your purchase of a second-hand house doesn't count towards GDP, but the cost of renovating it does. The bread sold by a bakery counts towards GDP, but the flour the bakery buys does not. The significance of GDP lies in its ability to reflect economic growth momentum. If GDP continues to grow, it indicates the economy is expanding, businesses are increasing production, and job opportunities may rise. If GDP declines for 2 consecutive quarters, it signifies the economy has entered a recession. For instance, during the pandemic, many businesses shut down and shops closed, leading to a sharp drop in GDP, which directly reflected the economic shock. The second indicator, inflation rate, the thermometer for measuring prices. Inflation rate refers to the sustained increase in the general price level. It's not the price increase of a single item, but a widespread rise in overall prices. For example, a rise in pork prices might be due to a pig epidemic reducing supply, and this doesn't count as inflation. However, simultaneous and sustained price increases in daily necessities like cooking oil, rice, water, electricity, and rent are indicative of inflation. Excessive inflation is problematic as money loses its value, reducing the purchasing power of ordinary people and shrinking the savings of retirees. Rising production costs for businesses may lead them to reduce investment and hiring. But inflation that is too low or even deflation is also detrimental. Consumers may postpone spending waiting for lower prices, and businesses may cut production, potentially leading to economic stagnation. Therefore, moderate inflation, typically 2% to 3% annually, is a sign of a healthy economy. The third indicator, unemployment rate, the barometer of employment. Unemployment rate refers to the proportion of the labor force who are willing and able to work but cannot find a job. It's important to note here that retirees, students, and those unwilling to work are not counted in the labor rate, so they are not considered unemployed. The level of unemployment directly affects people's livelihoods. High unemployment means many families have no source of income. Social stability can be affected. If unemployment is too low, for example below 4%, it may indicate a labor shortage. Difficulty in hiring will drive up wages, leading to inflation. One of the government's control objectives is to achieve full employment. Not everyone has a job, but rather unemployment falls to a reasonable level. Those who want to work can within a reasonable time find a job. These 3 indicators are interconnected. Rapid GDP growth may be accompanied by inflation. When GDP declines, unemployment often rises. Government regulation is essentially about finding a balance between these 3 indicators. 2. Economic growth and business cycles. Macroeconomics does not grow in a straight line, but fluctuates in a cycle of boom, recession, depression, and recovery. This is the business cycle. Understanding the nature of the cycle and the drivers of growth is key to understanding the direction of government regulation. In the long run, the fundamental drivers of economic growth come from 4 factors: human resources, natural resources, capital, and technological progress. These 4 factors, like the engine of a car, jointly drive the economy forward. Human resources are not just about population size, but also about education levels and skill quality. For example, highly educated technical talent can create higher output. Capital is produced means of production. For example, building factories and highways can improve production efficiency. Technological progress is the most crucial driver. For example, the emergence of the internet and AI has significantly increased productivity across all industries, accelerating economic growth. China's rapid development over the past few decades is the result of the combined effect of these four factors. Investment attraction accumulated capital. Universal education improved human resources. Technology introduction and independent innovation drove technological progress. And the rational utilization of natural resources provided basic support. In the short term, economic fluctuations are essentially a mismatch between aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is the total willingness of the entire society to purchase goods and services. Aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services that the entire society can produce. When aggregate demand is insufficient, businesses cannot sell their products, leading to production cuts and layoffs, and the economy enters a recession. The difficulties faced by many industries after the pandemic are due to insufficient consumption and investment demand. When aggregate demand is too strong, there is a shortage of goods in the market. Prices rise, leading to inflation. For example, real estate booms and luxury goods buying sprees at certain times can drive up prices in related sectors. Fluctuations in the business cycle are normal, but excessive fluctuations can disrupt economic stability. Recessions lead to increased unemployment, and inflation leads to a shrinkage of wealth. One of the core tasks of the government is to regulate and control the fluctuations of the economic cycle through policies to ensure stable economic operation. 3. Macroeconomic policies. When the economy fluctuates, the government mainly uses two policy tools to regulate: fiscal policy and monetary policy. These two tools, like the accelerator and the brake, can guide the economy towards stability when used in conjunction. Let's start with fiscal policy. The core of fiscal policy is the government's adjustment of expenditure and taxation to influence aggregate demand. During economic recession, the government adopts expansionary fiscal policy, increasing expenditure to directly boost aggregate demand, and reducing taxes to give businesses more funds for investment, and consumers more money to spend. This way, aggregate demand increases, production increases, and employment increases, and the economy can gradually recover. When inflation is too high, the government adopts contractionary fiscal policy, reducing expenditure to lower aggregate demand, and increasing taxes to curb excessive consumption and investment, thereby cooling down prices. But fiscal policy isn't a panacea. Excessive spending can lead to government deficits. Persistent high deficits increase the burden of government debt. Overtaxation can stifle business vitality and consumer spending. It may even drag down the economy. Therefore, the key to fiscal policy is moderation and precision. Now let's look at monetary policy. The core of monetary policy is the central bank. By adjusting the money supply and interest rates, it influences aggregate demand and investment. During an economic recession, the central bank adopts expansionary monetary policy, lowering interest rates to encourage people to borrow and spend, and businesses to borrow and invest, increasing the money supply. This injects more money into the market, reducing financing costs. This stimulates aggregate demand and drives economic recovery. When inflation is too high, the central bank adopts contractionary monetary policy, raising interest rates to increase borrowing costs, curbing consumption and investment, and reducing the money supply, making less money available in the market. This cools down an overheated economy. Monetary policy also has its limitations. Interest rates cannot be lowered indefinitely. Excessive money printing can trigger hyperinflation. Moreover, the effects of monetary policy are substantial. It may take months or even a year after a policy is implemented for its effects to materialize. This requires the central bank to anticipate economic trends and build momentum in advance. Fiscal and monetary policies need to be coordinated. For example, during a severe recession, the government increases spending while the central bank lowers interest rates, a dual stimulus to aggregate demand. Conversely, when inflationary pressures are high, the government reduces spending, increases taxes, and the central bank raises interest rates, collectively curbing overheating. But no policy can solve all problems, Samuelson emphasized in his book, That the core of policy management is balance, avoiding both recession and excessive inflation, balancing short-term stability with long-term growth. Government macroeconomic control is not confined domestically. With deepening globalization, foreign fiscal policies and monetary policies affect international trade, exchange rates and capital flows. Global economic fluctuations also impact the domestic economy in return. For instance, a foreign country raising interest rates can attract global capital, leading to an appreciation of its currency affecting exports. Rising global energy prices can push up domestic inflation, forcing the government to adjust its monetary policy. This naturally leads to the core of the next module: how to apply macroeconomic logic to the global economy. Understanding issues like international trade, exchange rate fluctuations, and global economic imbalances, and how governments formulate policies in an open environment. Next, we will follow the author's line of thought to explore how economics can solve real-world global economic challenges, examining the essence of international trade, development disparities between countries, and policy coordination in global economic governance, building on the macroeconomic control logic from the previous module. Once we grasp the fundamental laws of micro-market operations, this module requires us to apply these theories to real-world scenarios. Samuelson consistently emphasized in economics that the ultimate value of economics lies in solving practical problems, from trade disputes between nations to development gaps between rich and poor countries and boundary disputes between governments and markets. These real-world challenges can all be answered through economic thinking. This module will follow the author's approach to combine abstract theories with concrete realities, understanding the practical application of economics in the global economy. International trade. Why buying imports is also a win-win choice. In today's deepening globalization, international trade is no longer an either-or choice, but a must-answer question concerning the interests of all nations. The core logic of economics helps us see that the essence of international trade is not a zero-sum game, but a win-win through specialization. The essence of international trade is not about who is stronger, but about who is better at doing what. This is the principle of comparative advantage. Each country simply needs to focus on producing what it does best. China has a comparative advantage in manufacturing, able to produce appliances and clothing at lower costs. The United States has a greater advantage in high-tech fields, excelling in R&D for chips and software. The US has an advantage in high-tech fields, excelling in chip and software development. The two sides benefit from trade. China can access advanced high-tech products. The US can buy cost-effective manufactured goods. Ultimately, both can lower living costs and improve welfare. This advantage isn't just in products but also in resource endowments, technological levels, labor quality, and more. Saudi Arabia is rich in oil reserves, focusing on petroleum. Switzerland excels in watchmaking, specializing in high-end timepieces. These are examples of comparative advantage. Even countries that seem superior in everything still need trade to optimize resource allocation. For instance, the US excels in high technology and also produces agricultural goods, but by focusing on high-tech, importing agricultural products allows more resources to flow into high-value sectors, generating greater returns. While international trade's benefits outweigh its drawbacks long-term, there are always voices against globalization in reality. The core reason is, international trade impacts certain industries and groups. For example, a country's domestic manufacturing faces competition from imported products. Related workers may lose jobs, and traditional industries in less developed regions may be marginalized in the global division of labor. These localized short-term losses make dissenting voices easily amplified. But economics tells us we cannot negate overall gains due to localized losses. In the long run, international trade promotes technological diffusion, drives industrial upgrading, and lowers global commodity prices. The key to addressing dissenting voices isn't closing borders, but rather using policies to offset localized losses. For example, providing transition subsidies to affected industries, offering skills training to unemployed workers, allowing more people to share in trade dividends. Many mistakenly believe international trade only involves goods crossing borders, but outsourcing is a significant extension of modern international trade. For instance, the design of iPhones is completed in the US. Component production is distributed across Japan and South Korea. assembly is in China and they are ultimately sold worldwide. This transnational division of labor is essentially a further refinement of comparative advantage. Outsourcing allows companies to find optimal production stages, globally reducing costs, increasing efficiency, and ultimately benefiting consumers. Economic development. Why are some countries rich and others poor? The significant global economic disparity has always been a core real-world challenge for economists. Samuelson clearly dissects in his book The Root Causes of Wealth Disparity and points out the key path to economic development. The core answer lies in factor accumulation and institutional guarantees. Two major dimensions. Why poor countries remain in poverty long-term is primarily due to being trapped in a vicious cycle of low capital, low technology, and poor institutions. Insufficient capital prevents building factories and improving infrastructure. Backward technology leads to low productivity, forcing reliance on low-end industries. Institutional flaws discourage investment and demotivate workers, ultimately trapping them in a cycle where the poorer they are, the harder it is to develop. And the harder it is to develop, the poorer they become. The common characteristic of wealthy nations is mastering the code of economic development. First, capital accumulation through savings and investment, continuously increasing means of production such as building roads, factories, and research equipment. Second, technological innovation, sustained investment in R&D to improve productivity with new technologies. For example, from the steam engine to the internet, every technological revolution has propelled economic leaps. Third, sound institutions protect property rights, encourage competition, and maintain fairness, providing a stable environment for economic development. China's rapid development over decades is precisely because it hit the core elements of economic development. First, capital accumulation. Through attracting foreign investment, domestic savings have accumulated substantial production capital, building comprehensive infrastructure. Second, technological progress. Initially through introducing, digesting, and absorbing advanced foreign technologies, later focusing on independent innovation, achieving breakthroughs in high-speed rail, new energy, and 5G. Finally, institutional reform, establishing a market economy system, allowing the market to play a decisive role in resource allocation, while the government provides guidance and guarantees, creating a favorable environment for businesses. Conversely, some countries suffer from long-term poverty, often due to a lack of key elements. Some resource-rich countries are plagued by corruption, with wealth monopolized by a few, preventing it from fueling nationwide development. Others are embroiled in conflict where property rights are unprotected, discouraging investment and hindering technological diffusion. Some nations neglect education, resulting in a low-skilled workforce, unable to adapt to modern production demands. Economics does not advocate a one-size-fits-all development model, but rather emphasizes tailoring strategies to local conditions. For instance, densely populated countries are suited to developing labor-intensive industries first, fully leveraging their abundant workforce. Resource-rich nations can accumulate initial capital through resource exports, then gradually transition to high-end industries. Small countries can focus on niche industries to build a competitive edge. Crucially, the core of development is sustainability, avoiding over-reliance on resource exports or neglecting public welfare, and certainly not at the expense of the environment. Only through coordinated development that balances capital, technology, institutions, and the environment can long-term prosperity be achieved. 3. Policy debates. Should the government intervene more or less? From micro-market monopolies to macroeconomic wealth gaps and global economic imbalances, a central debate always arises. What is the boundary between government and the market? Samuelson's concept of compromise offers an answer. Neither blind faith in free markets nor outright denial of government's role. The key is to manage what needs managing and let go of what doesn't. Markets are not omnipotent. When market failures occur, governments must intervene. First, monopolies. Monopolistic firms can harm consumer interests by raising prices and reducing output. Governments need to use antitrust laws to break up monopolies and regulate competition. Second, externalities. Pollution from production or technological spillovers from R&D cannot be solved by the market alone. Governments can use pollution taxes and subsidies to mediate. Third, public goods. Public goods like education, healthcare, and national defense are not readily provided by private firms, governments must take responsibility for their provision. To ensure social equity. Fourth, wealth inequality. Market distribution based on factor contributions can lead to excessive wealth gaps. Governments can use taxation and social security redistribution policies to narrow the gap and ensure public welfare. However, more government intervention is not always better. Governments can also fail. For example, policies may be unable to adapt to market changes in time, or low administrative efficiency may lead to resource waste. Rent-seeking can breed corruption and undermine market fairness. Therefore, the key to government intervention is to be limited and effective. Manage what the market cannot and don't interfere with what the market can do well. For instance, regarding pollution, governments don't need to directly intervene in production, but can impose pollution taxes, allowing firms to weigh the costs of emission reduction against tax payments, and voluntarily choose more environmentally friendly production methods. Regarding education, governments should provide basic education to ensure fairness, while higher and vocational education can incorporate market competition to improve quality. Regarding industrial development, governments don't need to dictate what firms produce, but can guide through industrial policies and R&D subsidies to encourage firms to transition to high-end sectors. Economics does not offer universally applicable policy answers, but emphasizes analyzing specific problems with specific solutions. For example, with monopolies, some need to be broken up, while others need regulation. For welfare policies, some need improvement while others need streamlining. For industrial policies, some need strengthening, while others need phasing out. This balance is the core of Samuelson's mixed economy concept. Market economies provide efficiency, while governments provide security. They complement each other. Good economic policy does not favor markets or governments, but allows them to fulfill their respective roles and cooperate. Through international trade, economic development and policy debates the three major real-world challenges. We see the practical value of economic theory. However, the real world is constantly changing. With the rise of the digital economy, environmental issues are prominent, and globalization faces setbacks. Traditional economic laws face new challenges. How to regulate platform monopolies in the digital economy. How to balance economic growth and environmental protection. How to coordinate global imbalances. Global imbalance. How to coordinate. These new challenges are precisely where economics needs to continuously evolve. Next, we will enter the fifth module, Introduction and Reflection, exploring how economics can address these new challenges, understanding the core wisdom of its eclecticism, while also recognizing the limitations of economics. It cannot solve all problems, but it can provide us with rational tools for analyzing issues. Building on the logic of practical application from the previous module, when we use economic tools to solve real-world problems like international trade and economic development, we must acknowledge a core fact. Economics is not a static theoretical system, but a thinking tool that constantly evolves with the times. Samuelson consistently emphasized the wisdom of eclecticism in economics, neither clinging to traditional theories nor blindly embracing new trends, while also admitting that economics cannot solve all problems. This module will follow the author's line of thought to explore how economics can address contemporary new challenges, understanding its core value of eclecticism, while also recognizing its inherent limitations. New challenges in contemporary economics. With technological change and shifts in the global landscape, traditional economic laws face new impacts. Economics must continuously expand its boundaries, responding to new issues such as the digital economy, environmental crises, and globalization dilemmas. These challenges both continue the traditional economics' core contradictions and present entirely new forms of manifestation. First, let's talk about the digital economy. The rise of the digital economy has completely changed the operating rules of traditional markets. Its core characteristic is the network effect. The value of a product increases exponentially with the number of users. For example, WeChat is difficult to replace because the more friends use it, the higher its social value. The more users an e-commerce platform has, the more merchants it attracts and the richer the product selection, which in turn attracts more users, forming a winner-take-all landscape. This network effect has given rise to new platform monopolies. Unlike traditional monopolies, digital platforms build barriers through data and user scale. They can control prices through algorithms squeezing merchant profits, and also restrict competitors from entering. For example, in e-commerce platforms choose one of two requirements for merchants. This poses new questions for economics. Do traditional antitrust laws apply to digital platforms? How to balance platform efficiency with market competition? Samuelson's eclecticism offers a way forward, not by simply denying the advantages of platform economies of scale, but by breaking down monopoly barriers through precise regulation. For example, requiring platforms to disclose algorithms and prohibit unfair competition, protecting user data privacy, allowing market mechanisms to function within reasonable boundaries. This is precisely the adaptability and strictness of economics in the digital age. Secondly, environmental issues. Traditional economics focused on economic growth, but neglected the negative externalities of economic activities on the environment. The cost of pollution emitted by enterprises is borne by society, not by the enterprises themselves. With global climate warming, resource depletion, and other issues becoming prominent, economics must incorporate environmental factors into its analytical framework, forming the frontier of green economics. The core solution is to internalize externalities, making enterprises pay for pollution, thereby incentivizing them to reduce emissions. For example, by imposing pollution taxes, turning the social cost of pollution into the production cost of enterprises. Implementing emissions trading, allowing enterprises with high emission reduction efficiency to profit by selling quotas. Forcing inefficient enterprises to reduce emissions. These solutions retain the flexibility of market mechanisms, while achieving environmental protection goals, perfectly embodying the evolutionary capacity of economics. The economics of natural resources, also discussed in a dedicated chapter, emphasizes that sustainable development is not about abandoning growth, but about matching growth with resource-carrying capacity. For example, imposing resource taxes on non-renewable resources, encouraging technological innovation to develop alternative energy sources. This is precisely how economics responds to the challenges of our times. Let's talk about the globalization dilemma. Globalization was once seen as the perfect manifestation of the principle of comparative advantage. But in recent years, new contradictions have emerged. Unequal distribution of benefits brought about by trade liberalization. Certain industries and groups were marginalized, sparking a wave of anti-globalization sentiment. The rapid cross-border flow of capital exacerbated the transmission of financial risks. For instance, the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis quickly spread globally. National interests clashed, leading to frequent trade friction, violating the original intent of free trade. The evolution of economics has moved from purely advocating free trade to constructing fair global rules, for example by reducing trade barriers through international coordination, while establishing compensation mechanisms to help affected industries and groups transition, strengthening global financial regulatory cooperation to prevent risks from disorderly capital flows, balancing industrial security and employment stability on the basis of comparative advantage, achieving managed globalization. This means economics is no longer an abstract theoretical advocacy, but rather focuses more on balancing and coordinating real interests, facing complex new challenges. Samuelson, in a manifesto of eclecticism, outlined the core principles for economics to respond. No extremes, no dogmatism based on reality and theory. Finding a balance point between the market and the government, between freedom and regulation. This eclecticism is not a compromise of convenience, but the crystallization of wisdom from a century of economic evolution. First, a dialectical view of the market and the government. The core of eclecticism is rejecting either or thinking, neither blindly believing in the market's omnipotence nor denying the role of government. Opposing both complete laissez-faire and comprehensive government intervention. As the book states, modern economies are mixed economies. The market provides efficiency and the government compensates for market failures. Specifically, facing monopolies, not all are broken up. Facing externalities, the government intervenes through taxes, quotas, and other means, but does not directly replace enterprise production. Facing income inequality, the government regulates through taxation and transfer payments, but without undermining the market's incentive mechanisms for factors of production. This logic of intervening when necessary and letting go when appropriate is the practical embodiment of eclecticism, and allows economics to flexibly address problems in different scenarios. Second, dynamic adaptation of theory to reality. Samuelson's Economics through 19 editions has at its core the principle of theory closely following reality. When Keynesianism could not explain the Great Depression, it incorporated reasonable elements from monetarist and supply-side schools. When the digital economy emerged, it supplemented analysis of network effects and platform economies. When environmental issues became prominent, it expanded the scope of natural resource economics. This approach does not negate the past, but adds new dimensions to the existing framework. For example, traditional supply and demand principles still apply to digital products, but new characteristics like zero marginal cost need to be considered. The principle of comparative advantage remains the foundation of international trade, but new variables like industrial security and technological barriers need to be included. Eclecticism allows economics to both uphold core truths and flexibly adapt to changing realities. Finally, inclusive absorption of different schools of thought. The field of economics has numerous schools such as liberalism, which emphasizes market freedom, Keynesianism, which advocates government intervention, and welfare economics, which focuses on distributive justice. Eclecticism does not reject the reasonable elements of any school, but selects appropriate theoretical tools based on the nature of the problem. For instance, when analyzing short-term economic fluctuations, Keynesian demand management is more effective. When analyzing long-term economic growth, the neoclassical growth model offers greater explanatory power. When analyzing income distribution, the trade-off between fairness and efficiency in welfare economics is more valuable. This inclusive attitude of embracing diverse perspectives makes economics an open system, capable of continuously absorbing new ideas and addressing new challenges. Although economics is a powerful thinking tool, Samuelson never shied away from its inherent limitations. Recognizing these limitations does not negate the value of economics, but allows for its more rational application, neither overestimating its role nor abandoning its analytical framework due to its limitations. First, economics cannot replace value judgments, how to satisfy the most needs with limited resources. But it cannot answer what is fair. Fairness is a subjective value judgment. Different people in different societies have different standards. Some believe that more work, more reward is fair. Some believe that reducing the wealth gap is fair. Some support high taxes and redistribution. Some oppose government intervention in income distribution. For example, economics can analyze how raising the minimum wage will lead to unemployment, how much the income of low-income groups will increase, but it cannot judge whether the minimum wage should be raised. This issue needs to be resolved by combining social values and political decisions, rather than simply economic calculations as indicated in the book. Positive economics answers what is. Normative economics answers what should be. And economics itself cannot replace politics and value choices at the social level. Secondly, economics has limitations in prediction. Economics can explain the logic of economic phenomena, but it is difficult to accurately predict the specific trends of the economy. Because the economy is a complex system formed by the interaction of countless individuals, enterprises and governments, there are too many uncontrollable variables: technological breakthroughs, geopolitics, natural disasters, public expectations, etc. will change the trajectory of economic operations. For example, economics can explain that loose monetary policy will stimulate economic growth, but it cannot accurately predict the specific magnitude of economic growth after the policy is implemented. When inflation will rise, it can explain that trade friction will harm both parties, but it cannot predict the duration of the friction. The specific impact of negotiation results on the economy. The outbreak of the 2008 financial crisis also proved that even top economists find it difficult to accurately predict complex economic crises. This is not a failure of economics, but an inherent property of complex systems. Economics provides probable logic, rather than precise predictions. In addition, economics often ignores non-economic factors. Economic analysis often assumes rational individuals and unchanged institutions. But in reality, culture, institutions, social norms, and other non-economic factors are crucial to economic outcomes. For example, the same market economy system operates more efficiently in a culture that values integrity. In a culture lacking integrity, a large number of fraudulent activities may occur. The same industrial policy can effectively guide resources in a system with clear property rights. In a system with ambiguous property rights, it may lead to rent-seeking and corruption. Samuelson also emphasized in his analysis of economic development that institutional flaws are the trap of poor countries. But economics itself cannot deeply solve problems at the cultural and institutional level. These require the collaborative efforts of sociology, political science, law, and other disciplines. Economics is the core tool for analyzing economic phenomena, but it is not a panacea for all social problems. By understanding the evolution and limitations of economics, we can better understand its core value. It is not a collection of rigid theories, but a set of thinking tools to help us analyze problems rationally. It cannot replace value judgments or accurately predict the future, nor can it solve all social problems. But it can allow us to see the essence through phenomena, to see supply and demand changes from price fluctuations, to see costs and benefits from policy effects, to see interest games from globalization controversies. Next, we will enter the final concluding part, summarizing the ultimate gains from reading economics. How to upgrade cognition with economic thinking, making more rational decisions in life and work, while maintaining reverence for theory and the wisdom of flexible application. The ultimate gain from reading Samuelson's Economics is never to memorize scattered theories or formulas, but a thinking system that can permeate life and cognition. It allows us to see the logic of the world's operation from a rational perspective, and make decisions with a pragmatic attitude, while maintaining reverence for complex reality and the wisdom to respond flexibly. First, cognitive upgrade, from observing phenomena to understanding essence. In the past, facing rising prices, fluctuating housing prices, policy adjustments, we might have only stopped at emotional complaints or superficial judgments. After reading, we instinctively break down problems using underlying logic. Seeing pork prices rise, we think of supply and demand, the interplay of breeding cycles and cost fluctuations. Hearing antitrust policies, we understand their core purpose of correcting market failures and maintaining competitive efficiency. Facing globalization debates, we use the principle of comparative advantage to see the core conflict in wealth distribution, rather than simply taking sides. This upgrade in thinking is essentially breaking free from the shackles of intuition and bias, learning to analyze problems using the logic of scarcity, efficiency, cost-benefit, and dynamic equilibrium, shifting cognition from vague feelings to clear logic. Secondly, guiding action, becoming a rational decision-maker. Economic thinking not only explains the world but also guides action. When consuming, we apply the law of diminishing marginal utility. To avoid impulse buying, under budget constraints, we maximize satisfaction. In our work, we understand the logic of marginal productivity behind wages, proactively enhancing our scarcity to earn higher returns. When investing, we distinguish the alignment of risk and return, not blindly chasing hot trends but making rational judgments based on industry supply and demand and policy direction. This decision-making ability doesn't make us utilitarian. Rather, it teaches us to make optimal choices within limited resources. Whether it's time, money, or energy, we can maximize value through trade-offs. Thirdly, cognitive boundaries, understanding complexity and balance. Reading this book, we can gain a deeper understanding of economics' limitations and the complexity of reality. We realize that the market isn't omnipotent, nor is government intervention always beneficial. The compromise wisdom of a mixed economy is the optimal real-world solution. We know economics cannot replace value judgments, but it can provide an objective basis for weighing fairness and efficiency. We understand that globalization brings division of labor but also requires addressing the challenges of imbalanced interests. This cognition allows us to move beyond black and white thinking and learn to find balance amidst contradictions, building bridges between theory and reality. We neither blindly trust textbooks nor deny the guiding value of theory. Alright, that concludes our in-depth reading of this book. I hope it has been insightful for you. Finally, as always, congratulations on finishing another book.